In the context of forwards and futures, on Monday we discussed a little bit why they are different. There's this counterparty risk and illiquidity of forward contracts, and so a futures contract with a clearinghouse in between can deal to some extent with all those issues. But I also mentioned that forwards and futures are related to the concept of hedging. And so while some of you may be in the business school or may otherwise have come across this concept in other classes or in your own readings, I thought it was worth defining this concept a bit more carefully. Hedging is closely related to trying to deal with risk and get rid of it to some extent. And the premise of this is that, of course, in general, all assets have some risk or another, whether it's the risk of the asset price going up or down, or the risk of whoever's supposed to make you payments defaulting and not paying you. And of course, one way of dealing with that, if you could, would be to just find an insurance company and buy an insurance contract from them that insures you against whatever risk you face. But there is another way of doing it, which would be to insure against the risk of holding an asset, just going to write some risk, by getting another asset that gains value when your first asset loses value. This may remind you a bit of that discussion we had about idiosyncratic risk. Remember, we had rainy and shiny. When it rains, rainy company is happy, but shiny doesn't. In the other weather, shiny company does well, but rainy doesn't. And so you can offset those risks by holding both. It turns out that's related to forwards and futures. One way we talked about forwards and futures was by saying that by holding both the assets and the corresponding forward or future for the time frame when you wish to sell it, you can lock in advance some price for that asset, so you no longer have to worry about prices changing. Here's an alternative way of thinking about it. Suppose you have an asset and you expect it to be worth, let's say, 100 next year, which is when you are planning to sell it. It might turn out to be worth more, it may turn out to be worth less, but 100 is what you expect it to be. And of course, you could use a forward or futures, if a futures market exists for this, contract to, as we were saying, lock in the price. And if everyone has roughly the same information, then of course the futures contract will have a price, will lock in the price 100. But now again, a year passes, and it turns out that the price of the asset wasn't 100. Remember, there's uncertainty. Let's just say that it turns out to be say 110. Now you're holding both the assets and you're holding the forward or futures contract. But let's look separately at your gains from each of them. So let's start with your assets. Your asset was worth 110 instead of 100. So if we focus only on the fact that your asset is worth 110 instead of what you thought it would be, which is 100, you've gained 10. That sounds great, right? Now let's focus separately only on what happens with your forward contract. So let's see what happens in your forward contract if we pretend that you didn't even have the other assets, the underlying assets. You sell it, for 100. That's the price you agreed. But you have to buy it for 110, right? If you're holding only the forward or futures contract, you agreed to sell an asset for 110. You don't have it if you have only that contract. So you have to buy it for 110 and deliver it for 100, and so you end up with minus 10. So events turned out such that they increased the benefit from having held the assets. That exact same event decreases the value of having held the forward or futures contracts. But of course, those increases and decreases are exactly the same. So this is the sense in which this is an example of hedging. So you can think of it as just locking in the price in advance, but it's also an example of hedging because anything that happens that was unexpected increases the value of one asset, in this case the underlying assets, and decreases the value of the forward or futures contract by the exact same amount. They cancel each other out, and so in this sense, having both assets gave you, in this case, perfect insurance. That said, you could have bought, as I was just describing here, you could have in principle bought the futures or forward contract by itself. In that case, you would presumably be speculating that the prices weren't going to do this, decline. You would rather be, rise. That would be a way of betting that the prices will actually go down. Right? If we reverse this and said, let me just do this. Suppose it turned out, suppose it turned out that the price was 90, then of course your asset was worth 90 instead of 100 and you lost 10. If you sell it for 100, in this case you sell it for 100 if you're thinking of only the futures contract. You sell it for 100, but you could buy it for only 90 because that's what the price turned out to be, then you would be gaining 10. Again, you're still, if you had the underlying asset here, you're still ultimately without risk if you had both of them. On the other hand, you could imagine a different person who was involved in this forward contract because they are betting that this would happen. So that's another reason why people get involved in derivative markets, to make bets. Any questions or comments about this? I mean, their existence is ultimately due to the idea that people want to hedge. In particular, they want to hedge interest rate risk. As we'll see later, they may want to hedge currency risks and various other risks. But they could be used to make bets. The next thing I want to do is to move on to a different kind of assets, a different kind of derivative rather, called options, which I'm going to use to show you how it is that you could make really large gains, but also extremely large losses by holding derivatives, so much so that they were once referred to as derivatives were once referred to as, I think by Alan Greenspan, former chairman of the Fed, as weapons of mass financial destruction. So let's talk about options, which are lots of fun. Now, just right off the bat, actually, let me just give you an example of an option, and then we'll come back to what I wanted to say. Futures and forward contracts oblige you to buy or sell an asset at some future date at a given price, right? Now, as we were just seeing, in some situations that benefits you, but in some situations it turns out you would have been better off if you hadn't entered that obligation, right? So one possibility is, instead of having the obligation, why don't you have the right? That way, if it turns out that, let's say, you agreed to buy an asset in the future at a certain price, the price turns out to be higher, that's great. You can buy it at the low price and sell it at the high price. But if the price turns out to be lower, with a forward or futures contract, you have to buy it at this price that you agreed and sell it at this low price, and so you make a loss. But if you had the right, not the obligation, then you wouldn't have to do that. So let me give you an example of an option. There's something out there called a call option, which is the right, but not the obligation, to buy an asset could be a bond, it could be a share, at a future date, and as usual, at a given price. The price that's written into the contract. That price is called the strike price. And then what happens is that when this future date rolls around, you may decide to use your right. And when you do that, it's said that you exercise the right. But again, you don't have to. And presumably, if it's not beneficial to you, you're not going to do that. Similarly, there's something called a put option, which again is the right, not the obligation, to sell an asset at a future date at a given strike price. And again, that's going to benefit you in some circumstances and not in others. In either case, the option itself has a price which has a separate name in order to distinguish it from the strike price and the actual price that the underlying asset might end up having, and that is called the premium. It also almost makes it sound like it's an insurance contract of some sort. And as we'll see, in a way it is, and in a way it isn't. So to see what options are doing, let's pick an example. And let's take, for example, a call option. And let's figure out the benefits of having had a call option based on different scenarios. And we're going to do this ignoring the premium. So of course you do have to pay the premium to buy any option, but I want to ignore the premium for now so we can see what is the benefit from having it. And then of course we can use that information to back out, well, what must the premium actually be? Not sure if we'll get to that today. If we do, we don't, we can look at it next time. So here is the benefit from having the option. And what does it depend on? Well, of course, it depends on what the asset price turned out to be next year. So asset price next year. What else do we need? We need to know what is the strike price. So next year is when the option expires. So that's when you have to decide if you're going to use the option or not. I guess I should say there are two kinds of options in another dimension, which is one kind of option lets you, it's a call option, so you can buy at any point between between now and next year. Okay? Those are called American options. There's another kind of option that says you can only buy or sell. In this case, it's buy. The call option only allows you to buy the option on this day next year, so when it expires. Those are called European options. European options are much easier to talk about, so that's why it depends only on the asset price next year. You can imagine if it depended on all the asset prices between now and next year, and you have to decide when to use it, it would be more complicated. So here, you can only buy and sell the asset, as I wrote here, at a specific future date. What else do we need to know? We need to know what is the strike price. So let's say the strike price is 6. Now, what if it turns out that the price of the asset is 6? Well, if you were to exercise the option, you would have to buy the asset at price 6, and you could sell it at price 6. You don't get anything. But what if it turned out that the price next year was 7? The call option gives you the right to buy the asset at price 6. You could buy it at price 6 and sell it at 7. So that sounds great. If you buy at 6 and sell at 7, you get how much? You paid 6, you got 7, so your total benefit is 1. That's right, TJ. So 0, 1. Now, what if the price turned out to be 8? Even better. You have the right to buy at 6, you can sell at 8, you make 2, and so on. So on the upside, if the price ends up being higher than the strike price with a call option, you gain more and more and more and more depending on how much higher it is. So you're here betting basically that the price, or benefiting when the price ends up being higher than the strike price. Now, what if the price turned out to be 5? Then you could, if you exercise this option, you get to buy at 6 and sell it for the current price, which is 5. And then you would make -1. But you don't have to do that, right? If you could just not exercise the option, then you would get nothing. So you'd get 0. And the same for any other price that's below. If you used your right to buy at 6, you could sell at 4. You'd make -2. But if you don't exercise the option, nothing happens and you get 0. So on this side, you just have a straight line at 0. Of course, in reality, you would have paid a premium. So if you include the premium in your calculation, over here you always have a negative number because you have to pay to get this possibility of benefiting in this event or this set of events. But that's how call options work. They're insuring you against a low price for your assets and giving you the benefit of possibly gaining if the price turns out to be higher. Okay? Any questions, comments, doubts?
How is the strike price set?
It's a good question. The strike price, in reality, suppose this were a call option on, let's say, shares of Apple Computer. There may be call options with many different strike prices out there. It's a very good question, and we'll see in a bit why that actually matters. In general, there may be options out there with many different strike prices, and they'll all have different premium. So it's set based on just whether there's demand or supply for that particular kind of contract. It's not like, so you can imagine that if the call option has a strike price that's so high that it's unlikely to ever give you this benefit, then that option won't be worth very much. If the strike price is so low that it's surely going to benefit you, then of course there'll be a lot of demand, and so its price might be high. There's some examples in the document called the options worksheet, but I don't think we'll have time to do it today, so hopefully we'll have time to look at that on Wednesday. But in general, all sorts of different options with various strike prices could be out there. Good question. So, and of course they'll have different premium. So next, just for completeness, let's look at a put option. And this is going to motivate the next part. And again, we're going to ignore the premium. So again, on this axis, we have the possible benefits, ignoring the strike price and ignoring my spelling benefit. I ran out of space. Now, intuitive, you might think, well, this is going to be in some sense the opposite, right? Asset price next year, and just for fun, or just for simplicity, let's say the strike price is also 6. What happens if the underlying asset turns out to have value 7 next year? Well, a put option is the right to sell something at a particular price. So your strike price is 6. You can sell it at 6. If you want to exercise the option, you have to buy at 7 and sell at 6. What do you make there? -1. But you don't have the obligation to do it. So, in which case you get 0. So you wouldn't do it. So this would be 0. And the same would be true for any price above the strike price. What about the asset price next year if it turns out to be 5? What would be your benefit then? And you have the right to sell at 6. So to fulfill your contract, you could buy at 5 and sell at 6. That sounds great. You're -5 to buy it, +6 to sell it, and so you make 1. If the price turned out to be even lower, let's say 4, even better. You have the right to sell at 6. You buy at 4, sell at 6, and you make 2. And so on. So the put is kind of the opposite of the call, right? It's insuring you against a price rise, but if the price declines, you get to actually make profits. So if you think of it from the perspective of someone who's trying to insure themselves, they're insuring themselves against the price of an asset rising, but they're benefiting if the asset turns out to decline. Alternatively, they could be making a bet. You might use the put option to make a bet the prices are going to go down for some assets. But if they end up going up, your losses are limited to what? To how much you paid for the to get the asset, which is the premium. Okay? Now, there is one thing we've ignored so far, which is that if you bought this put option, someone must have sold it to you. What about their benefit? Let's think about that. What if we look at the, let's just use the term from before, counterparty, the other person on the other side of this transaction? Well, the counterparty, their benefit looks like this. It's the same labels. This is the benefit. This is the asset price next year. Well, if the price is 6, you don't exercise the option, so nothing happens. Just a second, I think someone had a question. Yes, this is still for a put. But yes, for clarification, you're right, we should check. The counterparty in this particular transaction. If the asset price turns out to be 7, again, you don't exercise the option, so nothing happens. If the asset price turns out to be 5, you're exercising your option. You're forcing me to buy it from you at 6. So I have to pay you 6. And what can I do with it? I can only sell it for 5. I buy at 6 and sell at 5. Whoops, that's not good. That's -1. If the asset price turned out to be 4, again, I would have to buy it from you at 6. I can only sell it for 4, so I'm at -2. So anytime you win from having a put, me, the guy that agreed to the other side of the transaction, the counterparty, is losing. So why would anyone do that? Well, the key here is that we're ignoring the premium. I sold this contract to you. So in these events here, I actually gain because I get the premium. I only suffer if the asset price turned out to be down here. And then my loss is, well, it depends on how far down the price dropped, below what was in the strike price. Now, why are these derivatives sometimes referred to as weapons of mass destruction? That might be more clear if we go back to the call. Remember, the call, if you bought it, you get to gain whenever the price rises above the strike price. But think about the counterparty. They lose every time the price rises above the strike price. And that loss is potentially unlimited, right? There's no, on the left-hand side, there's 0 limiting you, but on the right-hand side, there's nothing. So it opens you up to potentially unlimited. Is this what caused the whole GameStop debacle? Sort of. Once the, you know, if you're facing losses, so I guess we should go back to the other one. Well, okay. Maybe I went back here. So if the price is really high, and you're the person on the other side of this transaction, you're going to make a lot of losses. And the problem is, what if the price ended up being really high just before the option was about to expire? Then the person on the other side has no choice but to buy the asset and sell it to you. And of course, if they're buying the asset, then that drives the price of the asset even higher. So yes, we can go back to that and talk about it in a little more detail later, but that's basically the idea. Just before the asset expires, if the price is really high, you have to buy it to deliver, and then if you have to buy it, you're raising it even higher. That particular strategy, I forget what it's called right now. Anyway, doesn't matter. That actually leads nicely into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is that you can combine different kinds of options. This goes back to Marshall's question about how is the strike price determined, and I answered it could be anything as long as people agree to it. Let me give you some examples of things you can do by combining lots of different kinds of options. If you were a financial engineer, remember, you could have a call option, and the call option's profit profile looks something like this, right? And we also had something called a put option, which has something like this. But what if you had both? You had both, and suppose they had the same strike price, which is here. Off to the left, your put option gives you profits, but your call option does nothing, and so you have that. Off to the right, your put option gives you nothing, but the call option does, and so you get this. So in this case, it almost looks like you benefit no matter what happens, right? In reality, that's not true, because in order to do this, of course, you had to buy both of these, so you had to pay 2 premia. Not necessarily the same number, but you had to pay 2 premia. But what it allows you to do essentially is to benefit, well, if events happen here in the middle, then you lose the premium. But if anything happens that drives the price either very low or very high, then you gain. So it's almost like having multiple options in this particular manner allows you to benefit from any uncertainty. This particular strategy is called a straddle. Now, what if you did the exact same thing, but suppose that the strike price of the call is slightly higher than the strike price for the put. Then we have your put here, and then nothing, and then the call here. So here's an example where you don't have the same strike price, and as I was saying in response to your question, yeah, there are multiple options could exist with multiple strike prices. This is called a strangle. And what is it doing? Well, it's also just allowing you to bet that things are going to be very different, right? And again, in the middle, it looks like you're making 0. In reality, you would, of course, have to have paid the premia to buy those 2 options in the first place, so you would be making losses, but you'd be betting that some great uncertainty is going to happen. Again, remember that in any of these, there is always a counterparty. And their position is going to benefit in the opposite situation from you. By, again, ignoring the premium, The counterparty in this straddle thing, their benefit would look like this. If you add back the premium, remember you had to pay this person to get into this position, so they're gaining the premium and they're betting that actually things are going to stay roughly around here. They only make losses if things go too far one way or too far the other with the asset price. So this is a bet on stability, and this is a bet on uncertainty. You can have even more funky things. So imagine you had the following. Suppose you were this person. So you have this profit profile, again, ignoring the premium. But suppose you also had, and let's say this is the strike price X on this short straddle, it's called, the opposite of the straddle. And you also had a call option that has a strike price that's higher than this one. And you also had a put option that has a strike price that's lower. What would you get if you added all of this up? Well, around X, things are like this, just as with this. But then suppose we reach the strike price, suppose we're going off to the right and we reach this strike price of the call option. At that point, as we go off to the left, this position is gaining 1 with each step. Sorry, let me start again. As we go off to the left, sorry, let me start again. As we go off to the right, past this spot, which is this strike price here, this position loses 1 and this one gains 1. So what do we get past that position? 0. And now let's go to the left. Whoops. We go to the left, this gains, this is losing 1. Then when we get to the strike price here, this keeps losing 1, right? So keep going to the left, and this one gains 1. So it's also flat. So what is this whole position doing? With these, here you've sold a call, sold a put, bought a call with a different strike price, and sold a put with a lower strike price. Altogether, it looks like what you're doing is, again, adding in all the premium. What you're basically doing is making sure that you benefit if things stay specifically around here. If they move off to either side, you actually don't lose anything. Well, you lost the premium, but you don't have unlimited losses. This is basically betting on a specific, almost specific set of events. It's known as an iron butterfly. You could imagine doing the same thing, but instead of with a straddle, you do it with a strangle. That's called an iron condor. So again, by holding various combinations of options, buying and selling them, you can make bets on certain events or insure yourself against certain events. It opens up all sorts of possibilities. Yeah, the names are pretty fun. More fun than most names in econ, like liquidity preference theory and things like that. So I mentioned multiple times that these things open up opportunities, but also create various risks. And so I thought it would be good to close with a discussion of some of these risks. And what I wanted to close with was the cautionary tale of a man named Nick Leeson. And Nick Leeson is a man who wrote a book and then Hollywood, someone made a movie about his life based on the book, which is called Rogue Trader. Another cool name. What he did wasn't so cool though. So he used to work for a bank that no longer exists called Barings Bank, which is an old historic bank. I think, among other things, they may have bankrolled the Civil War for one of the sides. I'm not sure exactly, but they're an historic bank involved in funding various shenanigans over the centuries. And Nick Leeson worked for them in Singapore. And at first, his job was very boring. His job was to do the following. So Japanese government bonds can be traded in Singapore and in Japan. And his job was to sit at his desk monitoring on his computer. And if he saw, let's say, that the price of Japanese government bonds was slightly lower in Singapore than in Japan, then very quickly he would buy a ton of these and sell them in Japan for the higher price, which we call arbitrage. So that was his job, just monitoring his computers to do that. Nowadays, that kind of stuff would be done by computers. That's how boring it is. But so he got bored and started doing more exciting things, like betting on certain asset prices going up or going down. And he made a lot of money. He was lucky. And his bosses decided that he was some kind of financial genius, and decided that he was great and paid him a lot of money, and also decided that since he was such a genius, he was going to become his own supervisor. Bad idea. Moral hazard coming up. So eventually the bets that he kept making started to go bad, but since he was his own supervisor, he didn't have to tell anyone but himself, which he didn't. So he hid the losses from his bets, and then he started doing the following. He started making a new bet with the following strategy. If I lost yesterday, then today I'm going to bet twice as much. If I win, well, I can cover my losses from yesterday. And if I do this enough times, he thought, well, sooner or later I'm going to win, and then they'll think I'm a genius again. But he didn't. He kept losing. And at some point, what he did was he put a straddle, or I guess the opposite, on Japanese government bonds. And you remember, if you're on the short end of the straddle, what you get is this. If things stay pretty stable around here, you make money. Why? Because of all the premium, right? Which we're not counting here. If you counted the premium, you'd be somewhere like that, right? You have to add them all in. But if there's any shocks either way to the asset price, you're going to lose, and you could potentially lose a lot. He did this the day before a gigantic earthquake that killed over 6,000 people. So he lost a lot. And then the last thing he did was he decided to bet that the Japanese economy was going to recover quickly from this earthquake. In particular, he bet that the Japanese stock market was going to recover. So he just bought stocks because they were cheap since there'd just been this massive earthquake, expecting them to shoot up again once there was a recovery, and they didn't. So what did he do? He wrote a little note that said, "I'm sorry," left it on his desk, and disappeared from Singapore. He was eventually caught, sent to Singapore, where he spent some time in jail. And now guess what he does for a living?
Does he like write books or give advice or something, like consulting or something like that?
Exactly. He gives advice to banks on how not to do what. No, he doesn't tell people not to options trade. He tells people that they need how to set up their supervisory mechanisms, because the idea of him being his own supervisor, of course, meant that things got out of hand. And he's also a motivational speaker. And all of this was such a catastrophe that, meaning he lost so much money for Barings Bank that in the end, Barings Bank was sold to another bank called ING for the grand sum of £1. Briefly, they were called ING Barings out of politeness, I guess, but now it's just ING. They got rid of the Barings. So this one man managed to bring this gigantic historic bank to its knees. And he's not the only rogue trader. Every now and then there are similar scandals, but his is notorious. Thank you. That's right. They financed the South during the Civil War. That sounds about right. I remembered it was one of the sides. Well, the Brits are never up for trying to decrease stability. That's not what divide and rule is all about, right? So that makes sense. Anyhow, we've spent a lot of time talking about options. There are, of course, other kinds of derivatives. And there's some more work I wanted to do with options, but I think we don't have time to do that. So maybe we'll leave it for Wednesday. One example of another kind of derivative, is a swap, which sounds like what it is. You and I either exchange two assets temporarily, or we exchange the payments on those assets. Let's say my high school roommates ended up working for JP Morgan, a large bank, and at some point he was telling me what he was doing. He was taking this, imagine this Italian life insurance company. Their life is very boring. They collect insurance premium and then they make payouts periodically, but there's very little risk and uncertainty in that. So their returns are low. On the other hand, imagine a bank in Brazil. There are all sorts of macroeconomic shocks, various uncertainty of different kinds. Their return is high, but of course the riskiness is also very high, and they would like some stability. So you arrange a swap. The boring Italian insurance company gets some of the profits from the Brazilian bank's operation, so they get some more risk and higher return. And the Italian insurance company gives some of its payments in exchange to the Brazilian bank. So now they get a little safety in their income and a little less risk. So that's an example of a swap. Another example of derivatives are mortgage-backed securities. We talked about those, right? The way I described them was that a bank has issued a bunch of mortgages to people, and then they package them together and sell them. In reality, the way that tends to take place is that they're not selling on the mortgages themselves. What they're selling on are the mortgage payments. So they now get the mortgage. So they pay you up front, the bank, in exchange for you passing on all the payments from the mortgages, all the monthly interest rate payments. Let me give you another example of a derivative, which will come with its own cautionary tale. These are credit default swaps. These are, I don't know why they're called swaps, there must be a reason, but these are basically insurance contracts that pay you if, let's say, someone you lent money to defaults. Let's say if enough mortgages in your mortgage-backed security default, then you get a payment, and so that gives you some insurance, right? Insurance against these mortgages failing. But now remember these mortgage-backed securities came up many times in our discussions of adverse selection related to the 2008 crisis, right? So now imagine I do the following. I don't know, Goldman Sachs. And I'm a bank, and I own a bunch of mortgage-backed securities. And I know that they're not great. Remember, I know better than the potential, I'm the seller, I know better than the buyers whether this is any good or not. So imagine I sell this to someone, knowing it's not great, knowing its quality or lack thereof, and at the same time, I buy a credit default swap that's going to give me a payment when those mortgages default. So I'm making money selling something to someone that I know is not good, but they don't. And in addition, when it eventually goes sour, I get an additional payment from my credit default swap that I bought. Sounds fishy, huh? But this seems to be what actually happened. And guess how many people went to jail for this arrangement? One person. Actually, wait a second. He didn't go to jail. His sentence was suspended. Guess what he does now? Not consulting. This one's a little less obvious. He is an economics professor. I guess that's a little safer than, no, not here at GW, although we did interview him, believe it or not. He seemed very pleasant, very sharp, but we hired somebody else, and he's now an econ professor or finance professor, kind of the same thing. All right, so this is another cautionary tale about the risks and benefits of buying and selling various derivatives. Anyhow, all right, I think we're probably out of time. So let's stop there and move to our usual exit quiz. There we go. Sorry about that, I got my date wrong. There's no February 29th, obviously. In a futures market, what is the intermediary called? A bank, a clearinghouse, a counterparty, or a hedge fund? This should remember hopefully from last week. Good job. Good job, Cameron, especially. Here you have to sort words into the correct order. A blank option is the blank, not the blank, to blank an asset. So this is a reminder of the definition of a blank option, which you'll find useful in the next question, hopefully. Don't forget to press the K exclamation mark at the end. Very good. Most of you did well there. Cameron is still ahead. Good job. Call options are exercised when the price exceeds the strike price. True or false? Good job. Cameron is on fire. Next. True or false? Put options are exercised when the price exceeds the strike price. Someone is thinking hard. Good. Excellent. Frankie took the lead, just barely. Nick Leeson is what? The Fed chairman, a rogue trader, a famous actor, or a famous model? Finally, last question. What strategy is this the profit profile for? An Iron Maiden, an Iron Lady, an Iron Butterfly, or an Iron Condor? Good job. All right. Third place, Varun. Second place, Sean L. And first place we have Cameron. All right, Cameron. So, what suggestions do you have for what I should put on myself for the end of class?
Can we do the dinosaur chicken nugget again?
Dinosaur. I'm not sure we can find it. Let's try dino. Oh, no, there it is. No! I'm not sure if I can find it again. Let me try. I got it. All right, let me stop sharing. How's that?
It's perfect, thank you. It's perfect, thank you.
All right, no problem. I can't see it very well. Ah, there it is. Okay, excellent. All right, I'm now a delicious dinosaur chicken nuggets. Thanks for coming. Thanks for playing. I hope you learned something. Feel free to get a hold of me in office hours or via email or anything else. Until then, take care. And, well, look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.